Today I'm going to be making the henna culottes. So I have cut out my culottes in my size in this beautiful heavy cream linen. I've prepared my pattern pieces by drawing on the front, on the wrong side of the material, the pleat lengths. Now I'm going for the long pleats because I'm going to use buttons on the front. But if I wanted to, I could make these pleats half the length. I could make them maybe an inch, 2.5 centimeters long from the top, or even just fold them. The choice is up to you for the kind of look that you're after. I've used an erasable friction marker pen, and I checked that on a piece of scrap just to make sure that that would erase, particularly since I'm using a light colour. On the back, I have also drawn on the back darts on the wrong side as well. I've got my zip prepared. Now I'm going with a 25 centimeter zip. You could go with a 20 centimeter zip or even shorter maybe if you've got slim hips. But if you have a curvy figure where you've got a small waist and bigger hips like me, you're better off having a longer zip because it gives you more room to actually get the trousers on. I've got my pockets cut out. Now I'm not going to be using the pocket facing because I'm going to use the trouser fabric for that back pocket. If I was using a different colour fabric, I would be stitching on a facing, but in this instance I don't need to. For the pocket lining, I'm actually using this quilting cotton. So this is slightly darker than my skin tone, but that's because that's just what I have. And the reason for that is if I layer up the light colours and then have my skin underneath, what's going to happen is I will be able to see all those pocket shapes through the front of the trousers. But if I put this sort of flesh coloured lining onto the pockets and then have the trousers on top, you can see it through here. But when I'm actually wearing them, that will blend in more with my skin tone and then they won't show. So that's a little trick for you. But because I am using a different colour for this pocket and I've got the cutaways, that would show through on the side. So a little trick, I have cut some bias binding. This is 5 centimetres wide or 2 inches, and I've just pressed over a centimetre fold. And what I'm going to do is actually sew that bias binding around the cutaway edge of the lining so that when the pockets are seen from the side, you're only going to see the matching colour, not this darker colour. But I'll show you how to do that. So let's get sewing. I'm going to be starting off by sewing the front trousers, and the first thing I need to do is sew the front pleats. What I like to do is make a couple of snips at the top of the pleats just as a marker for myself. I make sure that I don't cut past the seam allowance. If my seam allowance is 1 centimetre, I wouldn't make my pleats any longer than half a centimetre, if that. So I just pop a pin in to keep that in place. To mark the bottom of the plate, I like to stick a pin through the marker and then just check on the other side. And you can see there, I've actually missed it. So what that means is I just sort of roll the fabric around a bit until I get the pin going through at the matching places and pin that together. And then I'm just going to fold and just give that a little pull just to kind of snap it in place. This is quite wobbly fabric, so what I like to do is rather than actually pin the whole way down, I like to use a little ruler guide. Now these pleats are 6 centimetres, so when they're folded in half, they're going to measure 3. So if I use my guide, I will be able to control that the straightness more efficiently than if I use lots of pins. So back tacking. And then I give it a little pull, and then I just check with my guide to make sure that's in place. And I can see that's just rolling over a smidge. So I'm just going to pull that over and sew a little way and check. And then I can just sew towards my guide. Like so. You see how I'm just sliding that down the fold of the pleat? And that actually makes it much easier than having heaps of pins. And I think it's actually more accurate as well. Sewing all the way to the end and back tacking. And take that out and cut the threads. And I'm happy with that. It's wobbled a little bit, but not too much. And the fact is this linen's going to move a lot as I sew it. So I'm just going to sew the other side. I've just pressed these pleats. So the pleat presses towards the centre front and away from the pocket bag. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to sew the edge if that was folded the other way. So that's just a good little way of remembering that. When I press the pleats, I press them thoroughly along where I have stitched, so in this case this length, and then I sort of lift the iron and skim it up for the rest of the pleat. So it's getting a light press below where I have stitched and it will stay in place, but I don't want to have actually a knife crease down the front. So just try that next time you're pressing firmly with steam along the section that you've sewn, and then just lifting with a burst of steam, and then that will help keep that in place without ending up with permanent creases. The next thing I need to do is sew the centre front seam. So I'm going to match the centre fronts together, right sides together, and I'm just going to sew that down with my seam allowance. You need to make sure that your seam allowance doesn't get bigger or smaller at this stage because of the way that we're just sewing the front pocket, and it's got that sort of tummy support in it and it's going right across. If your seam allowance on your centre front is bigger or smaller, it means that actually your pocket lining won't fit completely properly. So back tacking at each end and sewing all the way down. My centre front is sewn, and I'm just going to overlock that now, and I'm going to press that so it's nice and flat down the centre front. Now I mentioned to you that I was going to use bias binding on the pocket lining. So here is my pocket lining, and I've got my 2 strips of bias binding. And I'm just going to sew, first of all, along the cutaway edge with the raw edge of my binding. And I'm going to leave a bit of an overhang because I find that just makes it easier. So this is just a tacking stitch or basting stitch, stay stitching, whatever you like to call it. And I'm just sewing close to the edge, so about 3 millimeters from the edge, just sort of stretching the binding a little bit, just or forming it to that curve. And take that out so you can see I've sewn that on. Now I'm going to sew along the folded edge of the binding, just right on the edge. And what I want to do is just mold that. And you may find that actually if you give that a press, it will sit more flat. In fact, I think I'll start from the top on this one. That will be easier for me. Sewing right on the edge. And see how I've got my fingers pulling on both sides. I'm not stretching it this way, I'm sort of actually more sideways to help that mould to the curve. Like so. So now I'm just going to do the other side in the same way. So there's both sides with the bias tape sewn on, and I'm just going to give that a press. I have pressed the bias tape onto this pocket lining, and that's sitting nice and flat, and I've got no distortion or stretching around that cutaway curve, which is important if we want the pockets to sit flat. And I have the front of my trousers, and it's the right side up, and I'm going to place the pocket lining on top of the front of the trousers, right sides together. And I've just made actually a little notch in the center front of my pocket lining to match up with the seam on the front of the trousers, because I just like to have a bit of a guide. Now, if you have sewn that center front seam correctly, what you should notice is that there is a little gap between where the pocket lining is and where the edge of the front trouser cutaway is. And that's deliberate, because what it means is that after we have sewn that seam and we turn it through and the seam rolls, it's going to roll to the inside slightly rather than being right on the edge. Because what can happen is if it's right on the edge, sometimes you risk the lining actually sort of rolling through. If that does happen and you've sewn on a matching bit, it shouldn't be too much of an issue, and that does take a little bit of practice sometimes. So I'm going to just match up those edges and sew my 1 centimetre seam allowance along that cutaway. Be careful when you sew not to stretch that cutaway. It's super, super important. If you want that cutaway to sit flat, you must not stretch it. So if anything, I kind of push the fabric towards the needle rather than actually pulling it. And I'm going to do a little trick called chaining on, where I have come up one side and I'm just going to swing this around and go down the other side. You don't have to do this. This is just a fun little thing I like to do. It's quicker, it's faster, and it saves on thread. And if you're using an expensive thread, that can be a good thing, or if you're running low. So I'm just going to snip now that join, which releases it, and I can sew the other side comfortably. And snip those threads. So I have sewn this through. Now there's a couple of things you can do at this stage. Some people would snip into a curve. I never do that if I can avoid it. I don't like how it looks when it shows through, particularly on something that was light. If I snipped that and turned it through, it would sort of open out into these wedges, which wouldn't look nice through the fabric. So what I could do is trim that seam, but it's quite an open curve, and I actually prefer not to even trim it when it's like this, because when I turn that through, if I wanted to top stitch it, I actually have something supporting the top stitching. So let's have a look at this. Turn it through to the wrong side, and here we can see there's the pocket lining with my bias strip on the edge, and I could at this stage edge stitch this, or I could press it and then top stitch from the front, depending on the kind of look I was going for. If I was top stitching on the right side, I probably then also would have sewn some decorative top stitching on the pleats. It wouldn't necessarily hold them in place any better, it's just that it would be a nice look. But I'm actually going for quite a clean look on these linen pants. On my denim version, you'll be able to see I've done top stitching on those. So in this instance, I am going to edge stitch. So the edge stitching means that we want all the seam allowance to go towards the lining. So I'll be having my edge stitching right on the edge of that pocket lining. I'm actually going to chain on because it's easier at this point to chain on than it actually would be to take the fabric out. So there's my edge stitching. I'll snip where I chained on. Now I could go back in here and trim that seam allowance, but I'm actually going to give this a press first and see if I'm happy with it. And you can see that the edge stitching means that that's sitting over nicely, and even before I've pressed that, you can see that's sitting flat from the wrong side, and from the right side it is also sitting flat, and I'm not having any of that lining rolling towards the front. I've now pressed my cutaways, and I'm just going to hold this up so you can see clearly. You can actually see the seam allowance through the material because I'm using white, and that is an issue with white, but you can imagine if I had snipped into that, just how messy that would look through. But because my seam allowance is nice and even, it doesn't matter. It looks like a nice clean finish, and I could go back in there and actually trim that, which I think in this instance I will, not because I need to. You can see it's sitting beautifully flat along the curve, but because it is a bit see-through. So I'm just going to trim that. Turning it back through to the wrong side, and when I'm trimming, I like to use these duck-billed scissors because it just protects against cutting through with this nice flat edge, but you do still need to be careful. So I would rather cut through the pocket lining and have to replace that than the body of the trousers because that's a lot more fabric. And I'm just going to cut along this edge. And I think sewing is a lot like braille in that you use your fingers to feel what you're doing. So if something feels wrong before the scissors get there, trust your fingers. So I've trimmed that back, turn it back through. So I'm just going to check that. Yeah, and I'm happy with that. That's just a nice clean edge. Next, we're going to sew the pocket back onto the lining. So, okay, you can see that a bit more clearly. So that's all sitting nice and flat. So I'm going to take the pocket backing, and again I've made a little snip to indicate my center front on the top and the bottom so I can match those two edges. And I'm just going to pop a pin in the center front at the top to hold it in place, and then I'm going to come down and pop a pin in at the center front, but only to the pocket lining and the pocket back, not to the actual body of the trousers. And then I can just match up that whole lower curved edge. And I'll just use a few pins just to make sure that as I'm sewing I don't distort that curve. There we go. And now I'm going to sew that seam. To sew it, I'm lifting up the pocket lining and the pocket backing just to make sure it's separate from the front. And I'm just going to sew my 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around the curve. And just watch how I maneuver the fabric. I'm not trying to force it to be straight in front of me. I'm actually sort of work with my body and the fabric to move with those curves. Okay, that curved edge is sewn. Now I just need to overlock it. I have overlocked the curved edge of the pocket bag, and I've overlocked it on the pocket back side so that the top of the overlocking, which is the more attractive side, is on this side, but that's not something you have to do. It's just a little aesthetic thing. Next, I'm going to stay stitch or baste the pocket back to the body of the trousers. So I'm going to take that pin out of, oops, on the wrong side. I'm going to pin it onto the right side so that my center front is matched. You've got notches on your pattern, so just pop a notch, pin lining up the pocket cutaway with the notch. Like so. Then on the sides you do have notches, but what's most important is that the pocket bag is sitting flat and those three sides all sit flat. So just remember, sometimes fabric can move a bit. This fabric, actually the notch is lined up perfectly, but sometimes fabrics shift or move either when you're cutting or when you're sewing. So the most important thing is that everything sits flat. So pins in there to hold it all in place. And then I just like to check, just moving everything out of the way. This is easier to do it on a table rather than on the sewing machine. But I can see everything sitting beautifully flat. So I'm just going to start from one side, sewing all the way around to hold everything in place. I just find that easier than having lots of pins that potentially fall out when I start moving them. So I'm going to sew that. Okay, I've just basted the whole way around. The next thing I'm going to do, just to finish off the front, is I'm just going to stitch down the edge of the pocket to keep that in place, because this has a built-in waistband that's going to fold over, and if that's not sewn down it could potentially create gaps. So there is a marker on your pattern for how far you need to sew down, but you can also use just a little ruler guide. And the waistband folds over 4 centimeters, so 8 centimeters is the total length that needs to be in place, and I like to go just a little bit further to 9 centimeters. So lining that up and putting a pin in place, same on the other side. And putting a pin in place, and I'm just going to stitch right on the edge of that cutaway. And there's the front, done. Now I'm going to sew the back. I've prepared the back of the trousers by overlocking the centre back seams, and now I'm going to sew the darts. Like with the front pleats, I like to fold over where I've notched at the top of the waist and pop a pin in, just checking that that's matched. Then for the bottom, I like to put a pin that goes through a couple of the threads of the fabric, fold that over, and then pin through like that. And then I give that a bit of a pull and just finger press, and then I can use my pin to just check if I'm in place, and I can see I'm not there, so I just bring that over a smidge like that. And then normally that would be the most pins that I would use, but this is really wobbly fabric, so I'm just going to check by going through, and I can see that's a little bit out, so I'll try that again. Perfect. So I think that's enough. Snip the threads and check. Yep, that's good. All right, so I'm going to sew the other one in exactly the same way. Just a trick with sewing darts, don't try and line up your fabric so that it's in line with the needle. Let the angle of the dart dictate where you're going. So if I use my little ruler here, you can see that actually there's quite a triangle there, and that, if you let that happen and trust it as you sew off the edge, you'll end up with a nice sharp point on your dart, rather than having a scoop out, which creates a little pucker. Now I'm going to sew the other back. I've pressed my darts away from the centre back seam, and just a little note on pressing darts. What I like to do is I lightly press on the back or the wrong side with just a little bit of steam, barely touching the actual fabric, and then I turn it to the right side and press away in the direction that the darts are to be pressed, and that way I end up with beautiful crisp darts and no little folds. So you might like to give that a go. I've got my back trousers and I've put them together, right sides together, and I'm going to now put in the invisible zip. So I'm going to pop a few pins in place to stop it from moving around. Lining that up. Now, when we put the zip in, we've got the built-in waistband, which is going to fold over 4 centimeters. So what you can do is, with your chalk or your erasable pen, and make sure it does come off, you can make just draw a little marker onto your fabric showing that 4 centimeters, because we don't actually want the zip going the whole way up to the top, because this needs to fold back down over the zip. So in fact the stopper, the pull thing, is going to be at that point. Next, I line up my zip, and this is just a way of putting in a zip rather than using notches on the pattern and working with actually the zip length that you've got. So I've lined up my zip, and I can see that my zip comes to about here, making sure the seam allowance is really perfectly lined up. So that's, from there to there is the length of my zip. So I'm just going to move the zip out of the way for the moment, and I'm just going to then sew the centre back seam from where the position of the bottom of the zip goes. Now this is about 12 millimeters seam allowance at this point rather than exactly a centimetre, because we need to have enough room on the seam allowance for that zip to go in. So with my machine and my foot, if I line up the edge of my foot with the edge of my overlocking, that gives me the perfect distance. But just check on your machine, because your overlocking might be wider or narrower than mine and you might have a different foot. So I'm going to back tack. It's really important that you have a back tack at this stage. And start sewing around that lower crutch curve, and then as I head towards the curve, I come back to my 1 centimetre seam allowance. And snip those threads. So you can see it's just slightly bigger than 1 centimetre. Next, I'm going to set my machine to a large stitch, and I'm just going to sew that 12 millimetre seam allowance without back tacking all the way down the back. This may seem like a slightly long-winded way of putting your zip in, but this is the way that I use every single time, because it stops me from ending up with a little bulge or pucker at the bottom of the zip. Even after all these years, this is still the method that I like to use. You could also follow Kenneth King's method of putting in an invisible zip, which is excellent. I highly recommend it, but I'm not showing you that because that was his way of doing it, so full credit to him. I'm going to use 2 zipper feet. I'm going to use my invisible zipper foot, which has the tunnels, and I'm going to use a regular zipper foot. So what I'm going to do is open out this seam allowance, and I'm just going to finger press it. I don't recommend that you iron it. You don't want to have a permanent crease in there that at some point you might want to get out and then find that you can't. So just a little finger press to open out the seam. And then I'm going to place my zip onto the seam allowance, right sides together, and then I open the zip. I'm changing my foot over to my zipper foot, and you may or may not need to move your needle position according to your zipper foot. And then I'm lining up the stopper with that marker I made. So you can see I've got the edge of my zip lined up with that centre back seam, and I'm just going to sew that in place. I'm not too fussed about getting it super close. That doesn't really matter, and I'm starting sewing from the stopper, not from the top of the zip. So I've got that lined up with that seam allowance along the centre back seam. Reduce my stitch length again, little back tack. And again, this is basically just a basting, tacking, stay stitching, bit of sewing, just to keep the zip in place for when I come to use the invisible zipper foot. Make sure you get the stopper out of the way. You don't want to sew through that bit of metal. And all the way down. And snip your threads. Then I flip it over to the other side, laying it down flat so that my seam allowance is flat away from the back. I'm not sewing through all the layers. You can see with this bit, it's just, the zip is just sewn onto the seam allowance. Then I'm going to close the zip, and I'm going to sew back up the other side. And as I'm sewing, I'm making sure that I'm keeping that seam allowance very flat and open. So I actually just sort of give it a little sideways pull with my finger like that. Just to make sure the seam allowance stays really nice and flat. But I don't want to pull it so much that it creates a little bulge. just sewing up to the stopper. Snip those threads. Okay, so you can see the zip is sewn just to the seam allowance, not to the trousers at all. Next, I'm going to pull out that extra large stay stitching that I did. And that's come out. And then if I go to the right side, you can see the zip is basted in place and it's ready for the invisible zipper foot. So I'm going to open it up, change my feet over, so I'm going to put my invisible zipper foot on, keeping the needle in the center position for this foot, and I'm going to start sewing from the stopper, not from this tabby bit. And I'm going to line that up. So when you are sewing the invisible zipper foot, it's a good idea just to slightly open out and roll that part of the zipper. So a couple of little back tacks. So I'm just, see how I'm just sort of flattening that out, opening that. Depends on your zip. Sometimes they go more easily than others. Sometimes you just sort of need to lift the foot up and down just to get it sitting nicely into that tunnel. And then as I'm sewing it, I'm not stretching the material down, okay? If anything, you really want to push the fabric up. So if I'm holding that firmly, I'm opening or rolling that zip slightly open, not too far because that will cause problems as well. And then with my fingers up here, I'm sort of pushing the fabric up. And this linen is quite movable, so that's really going to help me. It could stretch a lot. And then just sewing as far as you can and doing a back tack and take it out. Sometimes it sticks into that zip a little bit, sometimes it doesn't. You just never know. Okay, before I do the other side, I just like to close it and check that it's looking nice, and it is. Open the zip again, and I'm going to sew the other side. So again, starting from where the stopper on the zip is, not going all the way up because of my waistband. Doing back tack and rolling it open. And again, I'm pushing the fabric away from the direction that I'm sewing so that it doesn't stretch as I come down. Sewing as far as I can and back tacking, and snip the threads. And I'm going to close the zip and just check that it is in fact looking good. I'm happy with that. Next, I just need to close the little opening down at the bottom. So I'm going to change my feet back to my regular zipper foot, move the needle position over, and then I'm on the wrong side and I've got right sides together with my centre back seam. And what I need to do is just, it's harder to see on this light colour, but there is just a tiny little gap of about 1.5 centimetres. And the reason I like to use this method is that sewing that little 1.5 centimetres with my zipper foot is easy. But if I was to sew the rest of that seam using my zipper foot, it's actually harder because it's not a very flat foot, having those sort of side bits missing, whereas a regular foot has a lot more balance to it. So I'm just going to pop that under the machine. Line it up, making sure that my seam allowance of the zip is facing away from the foot and not caught underneath. And do a back tack. and then just over sew by 1 centimetre onto that centre back seam, like so. Snip those threads. Check it from the front or the back or the right side. And there we go. No gap, a beautiful zip, and that's ready to be pressed. Here is my zip pressed. It's looking beautiful from the outside, and on the wrong side it's sitting nice and flat. And just a pressing trick, what I like to do is just keep it pressed flat just for a few centimetres past the end of the zip, and then I actually press the seam allowance together so that at the crutch it's going to all sit flat in one direction. But that's just a personal choice. If you like to have it open the whole way, you can, but I find that with the curve it actually sits better if it's pressed together. Now we're ready to sew the side seams and the inside leg. So I haven't overlocked these yet, and I'm just checking the fit on the waist and that I have in fact come in the right amount. So you can see I've got quite a sway back and it's fitting beautifully over. Yes, you can see my undies through. I need to change that, but look at the front with that darker lining for the pockets. Can't see my undies there. And I haven't turned this over yet for the waistband, but is it just me, or would this actually be kind of cool being super high-waisted like this? Something to think about. Now we're ready to sew the waistband. Now I'm going to say something quite controversial here. I'm not going to interface this waistband. I actually prefer them uninterfaced sometimes, even on a fabric like this, because I like the flexibility and the softness of it. However, you can interface it if you would like, and you can get these really good iron-on waistband interfacings, and what you could do is just iron on a piece like this around that edge. Because it's straight, because we're turning it over, you can easily do that. And if you do choose to do that, I would stop when you get to the pocket area, because that front is actually very thick and it doesn't need any more reinforcing. So you just interface the back round to the pocket area. Like I say, I'm not going to do that. If you're doing that, do that, and then we finish off the waistband. So we've got the top part of our zip is not sewn down, and that's for a reason. It's because we're going to fold this waistband over, and we want to fold it so that the zip portion is going to be pushed out of the way like that. So this is 4 centimetres. I'm just going to put a pin in so I can clearly show you. We're going to sew along the edge of the zip, and if I show you from this side, what I want to do is have the zip portion out of the way, and I'm pulling over the waistband just a smidge so that when I turn it through, it's actually going to pull it back because of the way the zip sits. So I'll sew that so that you can see it, because it's hard to control it while it's up like that. So we're going to use just a regular zipper foot to do this little bit. Make sure your needle position is correct. So I'm folding that over the 4 centimetres, pulling the waist over a smidge, and I'm going to sew down the zip. Little trick, if it sort of gets stuck because it's quite bulky, you can actually hold the tails of your threads after you've back tacked, and just to help that pull through. I'm just sewing right on the edge of the zip. Snip that, and this will show it more clearly. You can see I've pulled over the waist area slightly, and there's the zip tab, and that hasn't caught, hopefully. Let's turn it through and have a look. the way I turn it through is I fold the seam allowance under, put my thumb inside and pinch it and turn it through, and give that a little pull. And there we go, beautiful. You can see the tab of the zip is caught into that waist area and the zip is nice and flat. So we'll do that on the other side as well. So opening it out flat so I can fold that over. Again, if it gets a little stuck, pull those tails. Back tacking. And you can see the stitching follows the line of the zip. And turn that through and just check that it's nice and neat. It is. Yay! Okay, now we're going to fold the waistband over. So you could use a friction pen and measure along 4 centimeters and draw a folding line, or like I'm going to do is just use a gauge. So I'm setting that to 4 centimeters, which is just over 1.5 inches. Sorry, I'm really not great with imperial. So I'm going to fold that over, check it, perfect, and work my way along. So I've gone to the center front and I've got the center back done. Then I'm going to come to the side seams and fold that over my 4 centimeters. Lovely. Pop a pin in, and then I just can work my way in between each of those quarters because they're held in place, and I just check that they are in fact all matching. Okay, that's all pinned and I'm ready to sew. So change my foot back over to my regular foot. Make sure my needle position is in the middle. And I'm going to start sewing. Just a couple of stray threads there. Did I mention that I'd already overlocked that? If I didn't mention that, you want to have overlocked that first. And I'm going to sew in the middle of the overlocking, starting about 1/2 centimeter from the edge of the zip so I don't accidentally sew over it. And if your fabric's wobbly like mine, you can just take your ruler gauge and just check that you are keeping it nice and straight. Okay, and then before we go any further, we just want to check that it is nice and even. So close the zip and just check that your join is in fact perfect, which it is. Yay! Now I'm going to give that a press. I've given that a press. It's sitting beautifully. Now, isn't that the easiest waistband you've ever done? And you can see here on my pocket edges where I did that top stitching, there is just that little 1 centimetre pass. I've got plenty of room to get my hands into the pockets, but it's keeping the whole front flat. Tummies will be held in nicely with that clever pocket. And now we are ready to hem the trousers. So what I like to do is turn up 1 centimetre and just press that on the hem, and then I like to draw a line for where the fold is going to be. So I like quite a deep hem, so I make sure that my pattern actually has enough room for that. So what you want to do is measure your inside leg plus the seam allowance you want for your hem. So this is 8 centimetres plus 1 centimetre, so a total of 9 centimetres for my hem. Next, what I do with a deep hem like this particularly, I like to then fold it up on that drawn line and match the inseam and the side seam. And pin, and then just sort of give it a snap it so that it sort of folds into place, and then I can use a couple more pins. Okay, and I'm ready to hem that. So when I'm hemming my trousers, I like to start from the inseam so that my back tacking is going to be on the inside leg. And there we are, one hem done. Now you might like to even do a double row of stitching if you've got a deep hem like that. I think it looks really nice. I did that on my denim pair. Now I'm going to sew the other leg and give it a press. The last thing I'm going to do is sew on buttons down those pleats. So that's optional. You can do that if you want to. I think it's going to look really nice on these white pants. It's going to have a real nautical feel. So when I sew buttons on, I like to use 4 threads. So I thread the needle using double threads, so that when I pull the double thread through, I actually end up with 4 threads. Using this method, I only need to stitch the button on with effectively 2 stitches to get 8 stitches, and then they sit really neatly as well. Just grab my thimble. Move the buttons out of the way. So I have marked my button placement using the template, and I'm just going to sew them on. So I have knotted my thread. I sew through with a single stitch to start with, just to secure it. And I come up through the button. Sewing right through. Just the 2 stitches. Come through to the wrong side and then just over sew 3 times to secure that thread. And then what I like to do is actually make a knot in the thread for my next button. So snip that off below the knot and I'm ready to go. So I'm just going to sew the rest of those buttons on. And there we have it. Buttons all sewn down. How cute do they look? Now to try them on. Here they are, my finished Hannah culottes. So I am loving the fit on these. I'm so happy. I've got the low triangle version, which is the wide hips and the small waist. And you can see that even with my sway back, fitting beautifully. I think this high waist is really flattering, and particularly with this built-in tummy flattener of the pocket. And you can see too that that nude colour that I used means that the pockets don't show through. These pleats you can see with that folded fabric, and that's what I would have had, is this white line if I hadn't used that flesh colour in the pockets. When are you going to make yours? And when you do, don't forget, tag me at Pattern Union, because I just love to see your makes as well.